Well, welcome back. And today we are going to talk about drugs. In particular, drugs related to neuroscience, so psychoactive drugs or drugs that affect the nervous system, neurological drugs in different ways. Um, in class, I would normally make more of a point to talk about this picture here and see if anybody remembers this old um, public service announcement about this is your brain on drugs. They crack the egg in there and say that's your drug. But that's something I probably only remember, and most of you don't because I'm way older. So let's go. So a few general terms to get us a little bit up to speed so you can sort of speak the language of drugs, I guess. Um, First off, there are some broad classes that you can divide drugs in. Something can be an agonist or something can be an antagonist. And basically that means an agonist is something that binds to a specific protein or molecule and activates it. And an antagonist binds to a protein or molecule and inactivates or inhibits it. Um, the way I always have to remember this, for better for worse, is that in a book, an antagonist is like the bad guy. So he's the one who's blocking or inhibiting. Um, right. So another term, affinity. If we think about this, drugs are usually fairly small molecules that have to bind to some protein in your body to work. And affinity has to do with how well it's able to bind to or stick to that other protein. So if something has a high affinity, it binds very easily and very tightly. If it has a low affinity, it doesn't bind nearly as tight. And the importance of this is that if something has a high affinity, usually you can give away with giving somebody less of it. And that way you have less of a worry about off-target effects. Efficacy, this is related then to affinity. This is basically how well does something work. So you can think of, a particular drug for depression, an antidepressant. We might say, oh, it has an efficacy rate of 50%, meaning 50% of people see improvements of such a level. Right. Tolerance. This is the idea that as you take a drug, and usually we're thinking of sort of drugs of abuse, that it has less of an effect and therefore you need more of it. So you begin to tolerate it over time. Traditionally, alcohol is a very common one here, where at first it has some effect and then people get used to it, so they need more alcohol and more to achieve the same level of effect. It does happen with other drugs too, but this is where we tend to think of it the most. Sort of on the other end of that is withdrawal, right? If you're trying to remove or stop taking a drug, you usually will have some particular withdrawal symptoms. We think about this a lot with people who smoke, right? If somebody stops smoking, they're not getting that nicotine, they start to really crave the nicotine. Oftentimes they also get headaches and things because their body is expecting a certain amount of nicotine. It's not getting it, so it's leading to withdrawal. Right. And then at the bottom here, I have a note that most psychological drugs bind and act at the synapse. That's not true of all neurological drugs. Things like local anesthetics, like Novocaine, block sodium channels. You can imagine how that would just sort of shut down all nervous system transmission and work. But in general, a lot of the drugs we're going to talk about are going to work at the synapse there, although some do work on sort of the channels and molecules involved in the action potential as well. So types of drugs effects. So I mentioned that you can have an agonist, and in particular you might have a receptor agonist. Imagine something like a neurotransmitter receptor. This is a drug that can activate a neurotransmitter receptor. It's talking about, here we say examples of things like nicotine and LSD can do that. You might have a receptor antagonist, something that binds to and blocks a receptor. Antipsychotics tend to be a case here. You can see how LSD, which is a psychotic, and something that's an antipsychotic might have alternate opposite effects. Another type of drug effect is you can inactivate neurotransmitter breakdown. This ends up being the key thing for most antidepressants, where they block the breakdown of a neurotransmitter, leading to a buildup of that neurotransmitter that oftentimes is an antidepressant effect, particularly if we're talking about neurotransmitters of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. And similarly, you can inactivate the reuptake mechanism. This again is normally talked about with antidepressants and has a similar effect. We're increasing the amount of that neurotransmitter by decreasing the amount that gets broken down. So one question I always get asked is, how does general anesthesia work? Right? This is general anesthesia being when you're put under completely. Local anesthesia is you get the little injection of Novocaine. Maybe you're at the dentist office, you get a little injection, and you're out. But general anesthesia is when you get usually either intravenous or by gas, but you're completely knocked out, right? So the short answer is, I say something membranes change, binds to several things. GABA seems important. Synapses don't work so good anymore. Sort of scary truth, although this is becoming less so, I would say. There's some more recent evidence that I'm not fully up on, but it seems we do know more. But ultimately, we don't 100% know how general anesthesia works. A lot of it was sort of discovered by chance in a lot of ways, and then followed up on with safety tests and things, but we don't actually have a good sense of it. Now, this may be scary to you, but that's as true of sort of a lot of things. Something like Tylenol was discovered by random chance, and honestly, I've heard it said that if it was to come up to be approved today, it wouldn't even be approved through the normal process, but now that we know it works, it kind of does. Here's a question that I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit more when we can all get back together, hopefully Wednesday, online, is how do you know a general anesthetic works? Do they block feeling, which is what we think of them working, or do they just paralyze and block memory, or some combination of all three? How would you know this, and how do you think they work? And there's reason to think that we maybe don't completely understand this. For example, general anesthesia oftentimes doesn't always work as well in children. They seem to require a higher dose, but it's a little bit complicated. And there's been cases where children seem to have been completely knocked out, but seem to actually have had remembered their surgery, things like that, which is kind of terrifying. All right, so moving on to drugs of abuse, which is what most of you picked for your drug that you're going to do your assignment on. But in general, what we're often looking at with the drug abuse is something that has a common mechanism affecting dopamine or norepinephrine release into nucleus accumbens. So what does the nucleus accumbens do? That's basically a reward center. So this kind of makes sense. Drugs of abuse are taken because they make people feel sort of extreme euphoria, right? They feel extremely good about themselves when that's because it's just basically directly activating this center and bypassing the actual real things that are required to give you the reward. There's another class of drugs, stimulants. These can be sort of both good and bad in different ways, right? If we think about methamphetamine, that's potentially a bad stimulant. Cocaine is a bad stimulant, but also a lot of the ADHD drugs, Ritalin and such. So these would also be stimulants. What does a stimulant do? It's really about sort of attention and focus and things like that. But you can imagine, if we think about sort of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, this is raising your things like blood pressure and attention, and it sort of activates your whole system, is the idea there. All of these tend to be dopamine transporter antagonists, right? So these are things that are going to put more dopamine out there, actually, because that transporter is removing the dopamine from the synapse. Nicotine specifically, this is an agonist for the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which happens to be an ionotropic receptor, if you remember back to that. So acetylcholine is often, when I talk about it as being at the neuromuscular junction, it's what neurons release on the muscles to activate those muscles. But there are two main acetylcholine receptors. There's the muscarinic one that is in muscles. That should make sense. And then there's the nicotinic one, which is not in muscles. It's usually in your central nervous system, particularly your brain. And it's called a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor because it binds nicotine. So literally it binds right there, and it helps activate it because it's an agonist. Um, Over time, these receptors physically change, and they are become less responsive to nicotine, um, and then this causes them to need more nicotine to get there. But in this case, it's a physical change that happens. In addition to, oftentimes there becomes fewer of those receptors. Basically, they become desensitized. Opiates are another major category of sort of neuropsychological drugs. Many members of this family now, but this is, the opiate crisis. So we're actually, from when the time I started teaching this, we're much more aware of these, but things like morphine, heroin, methadone, sort of, that's kind of a different one. The main thing about these is they act like our endogenous endorphins. So these are the molecules that make us feel good naturally. If you've ever had, something that really surprised you and made you feel good, you can imagine suddenly you're in a sporting event and you've won some big match, or you've done way better than you expected, and all your pain goes away. You're probably releasing endorphins. Or also maybe they talk about like a runner's high, where if you're trying to push through something, you suddenly feel this rush of where things feel better. Again, this is your body releasing natural molecules that make you feel better. So these opiates tend to mimic these natural processes. Um, so what do these do? They basically inhibit the release of GABA, and then you have to think about this for a second. So GABA was an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if you inhibit GABA, you can end up actually activating a neuron. And so what neurons you're activating? You're actually activating neurons that release dopamine. So by inhibiting GABA, you end up activating dopamine, and dopamine tends to make us feel good in most cases. There are also some things we don't completely understand about opioids and endorphins, but they appear to have, outside of GABA, their own ability to bind and sort of just make you feel good in a way we don't understand completely. So how do opioids work on pain sensing? If we look up here, opioid agonist activates G protein activation, we're seeing here. This receptor becomes phosphorylated. And the main idea here is that by phosphorylating all of this, you end up inhibiting this G protein. Let's back up for a second here. Don't worry much about the details here, but just know that opioids can work directly on our pain sensing neurons to basically make them not work as strongly. And there's a whole signaling pathway here that we understand somewhat about, but you're not required to know. And we can talk about this later, but if we're looking here that opioid receptors are G protein coupled receptor, and that they in turn have to work on ion channels, you can maybe work out for yourself, are opioid receptors ionotropic or metabotropic? Right. So basically, again here, the opioids bind very much like any other neurotransmitter, and they can usually inhibit, but by letting potassium out, or they can inhibit by letting calcium in. Right. So cocaine is actually a very simple and basically kind of on its own, but it's again a case of trying to get more dopamine, and cocaine, like some of the other drugs, blocks the dopamine reuptake transporter, and I like this one because we have a better diagram for it. So normally if you're at the synapse here, dopamine is released in the synaptic cleft, binds the neurotransmitter, but then there's this little pump or channel here that takes up that dopamine and pumps it back into the cell or the neuron here. This basically turns off that synapse and makes sure dopamine isn't around forever. But what cocaine does is that it binds to that reuptake pump and blocks it. So now there's just dopamine sitting around here for a lot longer. And then this increases the effect that dopamine has. Cannabinoids, often very popular in the college population here. Generally, we're thinking about things like marijuana, right? And this has gotten complicated. People now seem to know a lot more about the different molecules that are in these, but the main molecule that we're always talking about is THC. And THC can do a number of different things. And I'll say there are other molecules in there and they have other effects, though they do seem to be much less strong than THC, and those molecules are much lower concentrations. So again, cannabinoids are sort of the body's original version of what THC is trying to mimic, much like your body originally had endorphins, and then we sort of hijacked that with opioids. Cannabinoids are what your body originally has, and now THC can bind to that. So there are cannabinoid receptors that bind to cannabinoids, and they basically bind to those receptors, and then they can inhibit the release of GABA again. That should sound familiar. So GABA being inhibitory, so it binds to and inhibits GABA release. So you're inhibiting an inhibitor basically, which ends up activating axons from the ventral tegmental area, that's this VTA, to release dopamine into the NACC, which is short for nucleus accumbens. This process of inhibiting an inhibitor is called disinhibition. It does have more effects. So cannabinoids are still not 100%. This is the traditional what we know. They have more effects than this. They bind to more things. We find cannabinoid receptors in other places. And it also probably affects serotonin as well. Right, this is a slide I will leave for you to look through. Really just focusing on the fact that cannabinoids and THC can have many different effects on the brain, some of which we think about affecting appetite and such, and affecting reward, amygdala, increased anxiety and things like that can be related. But to be honest, one of the reasons I show this slide is it's really hard to find real information on marijuana's effects on the brain, and this is sort of the best I could find from a Scientific American article. Hallucinogenic drugs, and I think people are going to talk more about these, so I am going to limit it. But generally, these are going to be working on dopamine and serotonin, and a big concept here is so hallucinogenic drugs, LSD being the one I think that's most well known, MDMA or ecstasy being also I think fairly commonly known. But the common thing that causes hallucinogen is often a sort of disruption of balance. And we talked about this when we were talking about Parkinson's disease a little bit, where there were sort of two pathways, and they're both supposed to kind of compute the same thing, and then at the end, your brain sort of compares the answer that came out of pathway 1 and pathway 2. But if you had a drug that only affected one pathway in a sort of random way, now your body doesn't know what to do, and it knows something's wrong. Is pathway 1 or pathway 2 wrong? It doesn't know, and it kind of tries to merge those two things. So that's why hallucinations are basically sensory experiences that aren't real but get put into your real life. So seeing something scary or hearing something scary, or could be an example of hallucination. And this is better shown here, right? So you have the direct pathway of how this might work, and here we're talking about dopamine here. These are the two that really get affected in the indirect pathway. And basically the idea here is you have information that comes from the cortex thalamus down, and then it splits into the indirect and the direct pathway. And if you only affect one of these pathways, you're going to get different answers when it comes back around here. And that's where your body gets confused, and that's when hallucination happens. Alcohol is actually, I think, kind of a neat example of how a drug can have different effects at different levels. So um, at lower doses, it sort of activates GABA receptors. This sort of makes sense. GABA is generally an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and then if you're activating it, you can see certain things start to slow or shut down. This is generally the experience a lot of people have with alcohol. Um, Now, at higher doses, you can actually block glutamate receptors. So this is where you get a sort of secondary effect. Same thing, inhibiting an inhibitor or, in, or sorry, activating an inhibitor or blocking an excitatory molecule have the similar effect. And this is where you start to get a secondary effect. And oftentimes this blocking of the glutamate is receptors actually is affecting sort of lower brainstem regions. And this is where people can black out, right? This is where you sort of lose full consciousness, is when you start to really block these. There's also some stimulation of dopamine receptors. This is why people find it enjoyable to drink alcohol as well. So medications for drug abuse, there's a molecule called anti-abuse or disulfiram, which people can drink to basically make themselves, if they do have alcohol, they will feel sick. This makes that less pleasurable. Taking the nausea-induced drinking to associate the two. This is not super popular. Naloxone and naltrexone. There's actually more now in recent years that become more popular. Probably need to update this slide a bit more, but these basically block opioid receptors, so you can't get the effect of taking an opioid. And to some degree, these are also used to prevent the effects. If somebody is overdosed on an opioid, you can use these blocking molecules as well. Similar, and I had mentioned it earlier, it's not here, is methadone, which is another molecule that mimics an opioid like heroin, but it doesn't give you the pleasurable effect, and it's also not supposed to be addictive. So you can take this to basically not get withdrawal from the drug, but also not get the same effects as the drug. All of these work to some degree, but it also, of course, mentions on the user motivation. Oh, and then Narcan is more to what I was talking about with naloxone and naltrexone. This is combined and outcompete the opioids. So this is the one that, people are supposed to carry this all the time now. Every paramedic has this. If somebody is overdosed on an opioid and you can give Narcan quickly enough, it stops very quickly the effect because it has a higher affinity for the opioid receptors than opioids do. So it can bind to, and then there's opioid receptors, and it can block the actual opioid from binding and having an effect. So it can very quickly stop the effects of an opioid, and a lot of lives have been saved with Narcan. All right, so that is what I have for this video. And there's one big class of drugs that I have not talked about, and that's antidepressants. And I'm going to leave that for class on Wednesday, where we can talk about it in person. So that is all for today.